Welcome to this Authors in Conversation panel featuring the 2025 Minnesota Book Awards finalist for the Emilie Buchwald Award for Minnesota Nonfiction. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in the organization's capacity as Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's book awards are sponsored by Education Minnesota. The Emilie Buchwald Award for Minnesota Nonfiction is sponsored by Annette and John Whaley. My name is Virginia Wright-Peterson. I'm a previous three-time finalist for the Minnesota Book Award in the Minnesota Nonfiction category, first in 2016 for The Women of Mayo Clinic, The Founding Generation, in 2020 for A Woman's War II, Women at Work in Minnesota During World War II, and that book launched during the first weeks of the COVID pandemic lockdown. Most recently in 2022, Rochester, an Urban Biography. I am grateful to the Minnesota Historical Society Press for publishing all three. So I know what it's like for this year's nominees at this moment. A lot of excitement. Congratulations. For this latest installment of Minnesota Book Awards' popular Meet the Finalists series, I'm pleased to be joined by Sonja Trom Eayrs, author of Dodge County Incorporated, Big Ag and the Undoing of Rural America, published by Bison Books, University of Nebraska Press. Christopher Lehman, author of It Took Courage, Eliza Winston's Quest for Freedom, published by Minnesota Historical Society Press. Michelle Phelps, author of The Minnesota Reckoning, Race, Violence, and the Politics of Policing in America, published by Princeton University Press. And Cathy Coates, author of To Banish Forever, A Secret Society, The Ho-Chunk and Ethnic Cleansing in Minnesota, published by Minnesota Historical Society Press. So again, welcome. I'm looking forward to our session. In the interest of making the most of our short time together, I'm going to begin with a round-robin question that I'd like each of you to respond to in turn. And then I'll have questions specific to each of you and your finalist book. So for this first question, I'd like you each to please share what inspired you to write your book. Writing a book is a lot of work. I know that. Hours and hours of dedication. I can see why the topics would be important to each of you, but what was that tipping point that motivated you to write a book about it?
Thank you. Thanks, Virginia. So just by way of brief background, I'm a farmer's daughter. I grew up on our farm in southern Minnesota in Dodge County. And my family has been on the front lines for years, frankly, decades, fighting corporate agriculture. And we've had a front row seat, fortunately or unfortunately, to the fundamental change and the corporate takeover that's been occurring in rural America, including my home county, Dodge County, Minnesota. Today, our family farm is surrounded by 12 swine factory farms in a 3-mile radius. And in May of 2014, my parents initiated the first of 3 separate legal actions against Dodge County officials and industry insiders. My mother had recently entered the nursing home. She suffered from years of advanced Parkinson's disease. And my father was in his mid-80s and he was home on the farm. And I felt this tremendous sense of responsibility and purpose. And, you know, if you love something, you fight for it. And as these battles continued, the tipping point that motivated me to write this book was my father's advancing age. As he approached 90 years of age, I realized that it was critical to chronicle my father's life on the farm and the fundamental change that he had witnessed during his long lifetime. it wasn't fair. My parents were in their twilight years, and they should have had the peace and quiet that comes with advanced age. But in hindsight, my elderly parents were actually the perfect messengers as they battled corporate giants and fought not only for the right of my family to stay on the land, but the right of all families to stay on the land.
Well, thank you so much for that response, Sonja. And I didn't mention, I'm actually in Olmsted County, so I'm right next door, and I live on a small family acreage as well. So I just felt a lot of connection to your story. Thank you. Christopher Lehman, would you tell us about the tipping point for your book?
Certainly. Thank you, Virginia. When my previous book, Slavery's Reach, came out in 2019, one of the few complaints that I heard from readers was that the book did not provide a protagonist, which is understandable because the book is about Southern slaveholders coming to Minnesota. But I figured that there were people who were freed in Minnesota who were briefly mentioned in the book. And I thought if I could find enough material on one of those people, then my next book would be a biography about that person. And of all the enslaved people who became free in Minnesota, Eliza Winston had the biggest paper trail. So I was excited that she had an affidavit for her freedom trial in 1860. So I had a document in her own words to work with. And the thing that really motivated me when doing the research to fill in some of the information that she left out was finding out that part of her years of enslavement involved Andrew Jackson while he was president and sitting in the White House. It was in 1834 when his best friend, John McLemore, ran into financial trouble and had to sell off all his property, which included his people. And Eliza was one of those people at age 17. But McLemore and Jackson had married into the same family. So Jackson loved his in-laws, and he knew that if McLemore had to sell off all his enslaved people, then McLemore's children would not be able to inherit any of those people. So Jackson stepped in to help the person who bought Eliza to pay for buying her, with the condition that the buyer only keep Eliza until McLemore's daughter was old enough to inherit Eliza, because the daughter Kate was 12 in 1834. But 8 years later, she was married, and so she inherited Eliza. But I was just so excited to learn about that and to write the book so that the information that I had found on my own that I know nobody knew about will be accessible to everyone. And that also helped me to tell Eliza's story as a national story and not just a Minnesota story.
Very interesting. And especially interesting to me too is that there was more written documentation that you found from a woman, which in my research of women's history, sometimes the women's stories are not as documented. So that part was exciting to me as well. Thank you. Cathy Coates, what was the tipping point for you to take on writing your book?
Sure. I first started this project in graduate school. As an undergraduate, I was assigned to read Last Standing Woman by Winona LaDuke. And her book is a book of short stories based on historical events. And she included in that book a fictional story about a real group of men called the Knights of the Forest. And this group of men targeted Indigenous people in Minnesota. In her book, they targeted them the same way as the Ku Klux Klan might have. At the start of her chapter of the book, she included an actual newspaper quote from a Mankato newspaper. So when I entered graduate school, and I was going for public history. My advisor was Mary Wingert, and she had included a paragraph about the group in her Minnesota history book, North Country, The Making of Minnesota. And she really encouraged me to research the Knights of the Forest for my graduate thesis project after I had started asking questions, more questions about them. So I did. And once that research was published online after I graduated, I received an overwhelming response from the public. I had requests from many people to publish this into a book or an article. And one person looked me in the eye and said, "This needs to be published. It is important." And so I took that to heart, and I got to work right away after graduation, and I felt a sense of responsibility, much like Sonja, that this topic needed to be published and put out for mass consumption.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Michelle?
So this book was the process of a long research project. And I think the most honest answer was that the project was born out of both tragedy and mobilization. So tragedy in the sense of multiple instances of the police killing unarmed Black men in particular, both in Minneapolis and across the country. So this project started with the killing of Jamar Clark in North Minneapolis in 2015, but also more broadly across the country as the Black Lives Matter or BLM movement was exploding across the country. I was in the midst of finishing my first book, which was called Breaking the Pendulum, The Long Struggle Over Criminal Justice. And in that book, my co-authors and I developed a model for how we understand how criminal justice practices change over time. And we were focused at that point much more on prisons and state level punishment processes. And what became very clear to so many of us who were working in the field of sociology was that we'd really erred in neglecting to study policing. And policing is the front end of the criminal justice system. So everything that happens to people later on, whether it be in the courts or on probation or parole or in jail or prison, all of that starts with police action. And of course, police action, as we know all too well, can be itself deadly in that interaction. And so the project really began as my attempt to grapple with why did it seem like cities, even progressive cities that were at least explicitly talking about race and racism and police violence, why did it seem like they were so unable to stem the tide of police violence? Why did it seem like we were caught forever iteratively? And if you look back in the historical record, it's a very long record of being trapped in this struggle of outrage over police violence, sometimes lethal killings, but also more routine forms of police violence, more common forms of police violence. There'll be cycles of reforms, and then there'll be sort of a period of quieter political contestation until the next eruption. And so that was really the kind of starting point of the book. So back in 2016, together with a team of students, I started doing a series of collected or connected projects, interviewing folks who were in North Minneapolis about how they understood this political moment we were in and their own experiences with violence and police in their neighborhoods. I started talking to activists and organizers and city bureaucrats and journalists, everybody I could think of who was trying to play a role in shaping what policing in Minneapolis looked like. And those projects stretched until about 2019. And by 2019, I was wrapping up the project and I was thinking about writing a book, but I hadn't quite figured out kind of how to situate it. There were a couple of books that had come out at the time on the Black Lives Matter movement, and I wasn't sure what the Minneapolis story contributed because there were so many parallels with Baltimore, with Ferguson, with some of these other cities that were the initial sparks of unrest. And then, of course, George Floyd was murdered, and that really changed everything in the city, but also for me personally. He was murdered quite close to where I lived. in an intersection that I would bike through all the time. There's a coffee shop there that I had written some of the work in. And it just, for so many folks in the city, his killing and across the country and across the globe was really a turning point in this mobilization. So if you think back to 2020, there had been a bit of a lull in BLM organizing during the first Trump administration as grassroots efforts turned elsewhere and including trying to protest some of the administration's decisions around immigration and other topics. And they really flared back in summer 2020. And it was so inspiring to me to see that level of mobilization, both in Minneapolis, but across the country and across the globe. I actually just got back from talking about the book in France, where, the murder of George Floyd had sparked a discussion about race in France. And so by the time we get to 2020, I realized that all of the learning I had done, all of the talking to the community members that I'd done in those earlier years wound up setting up a preamble to a story I didn't know I was going to be telling. And that it was so important to think about what happens after the murder in Minneapolis and to understand all of the efforts to secure justice for George, both from his family, from loved ones, but also from the community and city leaders, and to try and make sense of that several years of aftermath and why, in the end, so little seemed to change on the ground in Minneapolis, despite this mass mobilization.
Wow, that is quite powerful and amazing that you were, into the material, and then this international incident is sparked. Thank you. Sometimes we find our books, and sometimes our books find us, I guess, is how it works. So. All right, well, now if we'll move on to some more specific books about, or questions about your books, which again, I just found fascinating and was really glad to be asked to read them and talk with you today. So back to Sonja, your book traces the expansion of corporate farming in Dodge County, threatening family farms and potentially adversely impacting animals, water, air. And you powerfully intertwine the story of national economics, local politics, with the story of your family farm, your parents, your brothers, and yourself. In addition to being highly informative, you reveal the tensions that emerged within the county community and the immense pressures exerted by corporations. As you note in the book, a real David and Goliath dynamic. What role does courage play in the stories you share? And how did you find and maintain the courage to write the book?
Virginia, I like that word, courage. Courage, I think, started with my father and his willingness to speak truth to power. And in this instance, his willingness to speak truth to corporate power. I wish you could have known my father. He wasn't one to roll over and just take it. Here he was battling this corporate power in his mid to late 80s, and he still had a lot of fight left. And when he learned that yet another swine factory farm was coming in close to our farm, this one just a half-mile west, I recall my elderly father emphatically stating, "Enough is enough." But courage didn't begin and end with my father. My mother also had courage. Here she was in the nursing home, and I'll never forget going to the nursing home in Blooming Prairie to pick up my mother. I took her out to the farm so that we could meet with a reporter from Minnesota Public Radio. And that was the day that the photographer from NPR actually took the photo that appears in my book. And my mother had great difficulty speaking. And after 2 hours of sitting quietly, she didn't utter a word. The reporter turned to my mother and she said, "Evelyn," she said, "what do you hope to achieve?" And my mother, who whispered at that point, uttered a single word, and she said, "Justice." So courage for me was revealed as the events in this book started to unfold. My family has faced tremendous harassment and intimidation over the years as we challenged corporate power, tactics which I describe in detail in the book. I'm a family law attorney in Minneapolis, and over the past 36 years in my career, I faced countless battles on behalf of my clients going through difficult and contentious divorce or custody proceedings. And I frequently find in those battles that I personally am the target, as the other side, as a defensive tactic, will attack the messenger rather than addressing the message. It's an old trick, attack the messenger. If you don't like the message, attack the messenger. And so when I find myself personally attacked, it is absolute confirmation that I am on the right track. And so you dig in and you keep going. And in this instance, I just dug in and I kept writing.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Christopher, as you noted, your first book, Slavery's Reach, describes how slave owners from the South who came to Minnesota Territory to vacation were permitted to bring people they owned. Tourism in the region appreciated the income, so they chose to overlook the exploitation of enslaved people. The wealthy plantation owners also invested in Minnesota businesses. Many people are unaware of this aspect of Minnesota's history. Eliza Winston, the focus of your current book, was one of the enslaved people brought to Minnesota, where she successfully challenged this practice in 1860 in the courts and became free. You trace her life from birth through the various households where she was enslaved until she came to Minnesota. Her actions to seek emancipation were intentional and well-planned. How did you uncover the emergence of her courage and skill in your research?
Well, Eliza herself had provided the information, or much of the information, in her affidavit. In her own words, she talks about how she didn't want to marry an enslaved man after having already unofficially married a free man back in Tennessee. She talked about how when the sheriff of Hennepin County came to bring her from the lake house over at Lake Harriet over to the courthouse, the last thing she did in her enslavement with the Christmases was to take off her work dress and put on her fancier calico dress. And she also talks in her affidavit about how after Judge Vandenberg confirms her legal freedom, she's given the choice of going back with the Christmases or staying where she is. And in her affidavit, she talks about how she's choosing to be with her allies. So her affidavit provided a lot of examples already of her courage. What I tried to do beyond the affidavit was to look at secondary sources that would provide some context for what made her actions so courageous. I had to look up books about enslaved people and clothing and fashion to figure out why it was so significant for Eliza Winston to pack her own clothes for her trip to Minnesota, and why she chose clothes that were only from free people that she knew and that her late husband had known. And I had to learn about the importance of literacy, because one of the things that I did find that was not in the affidavit was that Eliza knew how to read, because in some databases of digitized old newspapers, when I typed Eliza's name under the name of one of her enslavers, Golson, there was an article that came up that was actually a listing of the local post office in Memphis of letters that had arrived but had not yet been picked up. And Eliza Winston as Eliza Golson was one of the people who had letters waiting for her. And it's my contention that nobody would write a letter to a person if they did not expect that person to read it. So that happened on 2 occasions that I was able to track down. And I think that at some point in Memphis, when she was with Catherine McLemore, that's when Eliza learned how to read. Because another thing that Eliza did that was courageous was she decided on her own that she wanted to go to church without her enslavers. And they allowed her to do that. And she chose a church that had other enslaved people as members, but also people who were free and African American, people who were enslavers, but also people who had no interest in owning people. So she surrounded herself as much as possible with people who broke away from the whole master slave relationships that she had largely been limited to in her enslavement. Whenever she could find people who thought like her, she surrounded herself with them as much as possible.
Yeah, she clearly had a plan, and she navigated very, very thoughtfully to get where she ultimately did. It's such an inspirational story. So, Michelle, you were well into this police violence and anti-police violence activism in Minneapolis when George Floyd was killed. You've addressed some of this earlier in your answer, but how did his murder impact your research and the approach you took in writing the book?
So I think the book would have looked really different in terms of, I think if before the murder, the project was really focused on how both everyday residents and activists and organizers and people showing up to protest were making sense of police violence and what they wanted to see changed in terms of policing politics and how they envisioned the future of safety in their neighborhoods, and the different competing visions. So part of that work was about outlining how and why some organizers and residents turned to this idea of police abolition and police defunding, while others continued to defend the idea of police reform and tried to push for what I call radical or transformative reforms to policing. So really overhauling the structure of policing. And so the project before the murder was very focused on how do all of these different voices in the community shaping the kind of public conversation about policing. How do they understand police as an institution, and what is it that they want to see in the future, and what were their own experiences with violence and safety and policing in the community? And what really changed for me after the murder was that I realized that I was in a really unique position to study the aftermath, the political aftermath of the murder. I joke that this is a book about the Minneapolis Police Department that actually has nothing to do with the MPD. It's not an ethnography of the police. It is about all of the people in the community that are around the MPD trying to shift its policies and practices and the broader social structure that creates the kinds of calls for help that MPD is often responding to and the neighborhood conditions that they're responding to. And so what really shifted for me was that I realized that I had an obligation really and a responsibility to trace not just these contestations about ideas about what public safety would look like, but the very real material victories and losses in the struggle for justice. And so it shifted very much from studying people on the ground to studying up and thinking about the power structure in the city and the state and the country, and trying to think about how that broader political ecosystem shaped this seeming inevitable cycle of outrage and reform in cities like Minneapolis. So it became much more of a political history of the present more than anything else in the back half of the book. And so the book as it stands is sort of it's divided into 2 parts, part 1 and part 2, and tonally they're quite different, because part 1 is unpacking How do we understand why the city was lit on fire? How do we understand how we get to the Powderhorn Declaration with a majority of the city council promising to begin the promise of ending the MPD? And the back half of the book really just traces the outcomes of that political struggle, more akin to what a kind of history book would do, looking back at a longer term past. And so it turned out to be a really different book, and it felt really important to do this work, but it also felt like an obligation. Like I was in this moment. Nobody in the sort of academic fields that I was studying in was thinking about this particular city in this particular moment with this particular context. And it felt really important to record the story of Minneapolis and what happens after summer 2020. And as I was writing, I really expected that there would be journalists and organizers, people who were in the movement, who were writing more memoir style books. I expected journalists to write long form journalistic accounts of what happened in Minneapolis. And there's pieces of that, but I think what the Minneapolis Reckoning does to trace the process from the beginning to the end is really unique. And it felt like a real privilege to be able to write part of that story.
That is amazing. And taking that sociologist's lens, which really dives into the complexities, like you said, the book is not just about the police department, but all of the other factors and dynamics surrounding it. So that is, yeah, really, really powerful. Thank you. Moving on to Cathy then. Your book focuses on a hidden story in Minnesota as well. The banishment of the Ho-Chunk people, sometimes referred to as Winnebago in the past. The histories of the Dakota and Ojibwe people in Minnesota have been much more broadly shared. And I also was especially interested in seeing what you've written about the Ho-Chunk being in southeastern Minnesota, where I was more familiar with the Ho-Chunk than the Dakota or the Ojibwe. So I'm glad to see this history being shared more broadly. How did you come across these documents that describe the secret societies that dedicated themselves to the removal and extermination of the Ho-Chunk communities in Minnesota? And then once you discovered them, how did you encounter any resistance? You talked about a lot of people supporting the idea of publishing and making this history better known, but did you encounter any resistance or attempts to suppress telling this story?
When I first started researching the topic, I was focused on finding out this group of men. I really wanted to find who they were and what they did. What were their activities? Did they actually commit violence, or did they just sort of allude to it in their newspaper articles? There was one historian in Mankato who had researched the men somewhat, and he was a professor at Mankato State University. He and Mary Wingard had based all their research on the Knights of the Forest from several newspaper articles that were written in the decades following the war in Mankato newspapers. These articles named men, and they purportedly described some of their activities. So I went to Mankato when I started my research, and I went to the university where the professor worked to look in the archives at his research. And I found a lot of research, the papers of Thomas Hughes, who was a contemporary historian from the 1860s in Mankato. I had read his book on the history of Blue Earth County, but reading his papers got me a lot more information on the Knights of the Forest and the men in the group. And I also found they had added a time capsule when they built Mankato State University, and somebody had left the ritual document for the Knights of the Forest in this time capsule. So when I was searching in the archives for the names of the men I had or the Knights of the Forest. This time capsule had recently been made available online to the public, so I found it. And when I went there and saw this ritual document, I had a sort of a moment. It was like a smoking gun. These men, it proved that these men were real. They existed. They had documents. They held meetings. This document was printed on a printing press in the 1862 Minnesota, and there was only a few printing presses in the town. And it really proved that they were not just rabble rousers, as one local historian had said that they were. And I also spent hundreds of hours at a microfilm machine, both at the Historical Society and in my local libraries. There are handwritten letters that every tribe had an agency to the federal government in the 1800s, and they would write letters back and forth to the government. So I read thousands probably of handwritten letters. Sometimes one letter would take me a half hour to read, and there would be no information that was useful. But this is where I found the petition document, and I was able to have lists of names who signed the petition, a senator who sent the petition in. I found a lot of happenings on the reservation from their agent, and a lot of details in these letters. But the ritual document that I found at the archives was undoubtedly the most important document. There was really no proof that these newspaper articles were just sort of bragging or just saying that they had saved the town is what they had thought they had done. So when I found the ritual document, I knew they were real, and I knew that was important. And no other historian had come across that document before, not Mary Wingard, not the Mankato professor, not anyone except for the graduate student who had taken it out and put it online. As far as resistance, people in Mankato at the County Historical Society, they were not overly thrilled that I was doing this kind of research on some of their so-called town fathers. Charles Chapman is one of the main protagonists, and he was a land surveyor, and he did a lot of the maps in town. He has a home that's on the historics registry in Mankato. There's a street named after him in Mankato. But they did not outright discourage or resist me doing the research. However, I can say in between the time that I researched the topic for my thesis and the time that I went back to Mankato when I was writing the book, some archival papers suspiciously went missing. And namely, it was for Senator Morton Wilkinson. There was archival papers both at the County Historical Society and at the Mankato State Archives of his. I think this Historical Society had more of his his professional papers, and the archives had some of his other papers. When I went back, they were missing at both places. So I do have pictures of the ones at the Mankato archives. I took pictures of everything while I was at the archives. So I do have copies of those. I did not take pictures at the Historical Society. So those ones may be lost forever unless they turn up somewhere. I don't know, things like that happen, but it was suspicious that it was both places. So, yeah.
Wow, quite the story of your persistence. I think any of us that do this kind of historical research, that microfiche machine, I tell you, I mean, I'm grateful for it, but that is the most, from my perspective, tedious part of the research we do. And it sounds like you spent quite a bit of time, and were very persistent in looking for this information. And then, how interesting that some of it disappeared. Really fascinating. So glad you got to it before it did. All right, so now we'll do another round, and that round was more focused on kind of courage and courage and persistence, both of our subject matters and for you as writers. The second question, Sonja, the history you shared is very recent and ongoing, I suspect. And what impact do you hope that your book will have?
I think that's a fascinating question. I am actually thrilled with the reaction to this book. It's truly hit a nerve. This book is part of an unfolding story that continues to occur across rural America because we have community after community fighting this corporate takeover of rural areas. And I've heard from countless individuals in rural America who have shared similar stories of hurt, of pain, and as we witness the hollowing out of the areas that many of us still call home. You know, we've watched and witnessed the painful closing of schools, consolidation of schools, closing of churches, local businesses, and it's very painful for people to witness these corporate giants coming in and trampling and destroying the places that many of us still call home. And I've discovered that this is not only my story, but it's our story. And the book has given others the opportunity to step forward and start telling their stories. And it's part of the healing process for people. And quite honestly, it's been part of the healing process for me. And, you know, although the book is still, I would say, kind of in its infancy, it's inspired others on the front lines fighting corporate agriculture. I'm working actually currently with a number of communities that are on the front lines, including North Dakota, northern Minnesota, western Wisconsin. I'll be at an event tomorrow, Missouri. And next week, I'm actually going to participate in an event that's sponsored by Farm Aid, which is Willie Nelson's organization. So I'm really thankful. The book has inspired others as they find out they're not alone. They find out that the corporate playbook that I describe in my book is oftentimes the exact same playbook that they're seeing in their own community. And I think that it helps others kind of find their footing and gives them the courage, hopefully, to step forward. So many people have been silenced along the way in these rural communities, and they're afraid. Their businesses are threatened, their jobs are threatened, and we need to give folks in rural areas the right and the privilege to speak out. Thank you.
Absolutely. How exciting that a book can inspire continued activism, really, around a topic. Congratulations on that. Christopher, Eliza Winston was not able to calmly live in Minnesota after her court-mandated emancipation. She had to flee the courthouse. I was just so surprised. This story is just riveting. She had to flee the courthouse accompanied by supporters and then take refuge in homes that were part of Hennepin County's Underground Railroad. Mobs came for her right out of the courthouse. There were clearly pro-slavery organizations and individuals prone to violence. Again, a part of Minnesota history that I don't think everyone knows. They, after hiding in Minnesota for several months, Eliza Winston leaves Minnesota. And this is such a powerful story, an important piece of our history. What did you learn about how her story was repressed and why Eliza Winston isn't yet a well-known name today? Hopefully your book will change that.
Well, thank you. I hope so too. Well, when Eliza Winston was freed by the court in 1860, she actually received quite a bit of press in Minnesota papers and in papers in the South. The papers in the South were overwhelmingly negative about her becoming emancipated, and many of them took the tone of After all the money that we in the South have given to Minnesota and their tourist locations, this is how they thank us. And in Minnesota, the press was divided, with the Republican press leaning towards being happy about Eliza's emancipation, and the Democrat leading newspapers regretting that Minnesotans got involved in somebody's master slave relationship. And the South continued to be bitter about Eliza Winston until the Civil War began, about half a year later. And it just didn't make sense to keep harping on Minnesota freeing one person when several states in the North now had soldiers who were just killing Southerners and Confederates more specifically. So the South stopped talking about Eliza Winston after 1861. But by the start of the Civil War, Eliza Winston was already safe in Detroit, and she lived a very private life for the rest of her life. I could not find any newspapers that have her speaking in her own words about what had happened to her. And it's certainly understandable that she might not have wanted to revisit that part of her life. So that left the people in Minnesota who had experience helping out Eliza or playing some other role in Eliza Winston's emancipation in Minnesota. And for the most part, the people who gave their recollections talked about their roles in helping to free Eliza. But in talking about themselves, they didn't talk as much about Eliza. They didn't go out of their way to say things like how brave Eliza was to pursue her freedom and to risk all sorts of harm and violence to her in order to seek it. And they just minimized her out of her own story. And then to make matters worse, there was a local radio station that did a dramatization of the incident in 1934. And then one of the Twin Cities newspapers had a transcript of that radio episode. And that portrayed her as this very confused and overwhelmed old lady, even though she was 43 when she was freed. And it just talked about how unnecessary it was for Eliza's allies to carry on the way that they did. It didn't mention the violence of the mob, and perhaps that was bad too. And another legacy of that radio show is that it gave Eliza's husband a name that is not confirmed by any historical document. It refers to Eliza's husband as Jim Winston, but I looked and there was no record of any free African American in Memphis named Jim Winston or James Winston. I don't know why the radio show felt the need to do that, but regardless of the source of the name Winston, it seems to be the name that Eliza chose for herself in her freedom. Otherwise, she would have continued to be known as Eliza Gulson, or perhaps even Eliza Christmas. But Eliza Winston is her name, and I wanted to make sure that I found as many documents as I could that would allow her to be the center of her own story finally.
Thank you for that. Again, it's how the histories kind of, we find them and then they disappear or things are repressed. It's just fascinating to me how our histories evolve. So Michelle, the challenges of racism, neighborhood violence, and police violence are far from being resolved, unfortunately. What impact do you hope your book will have?
So it's hard to answer this question where we sit right now in spring of 2025 during a second Trump administration. When my book was published in May last summer, it really felt like there was a moment and an opening and an opportunity to revisit the lessons of summer 2020. And I think, a lot of folks who were out in the streets in summer 2020, if you would ask them what they expected to see in the world in 2025, I feel safe to speak for others to say that I think the folks would be not just disappointed, but horrified at what things look like now, nearly 5 years later, particularly in terms of national politics. And, summer 2020 was such a moment of hope, and it was such a moment of, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and all of the massive structural shifts that were introduced to try and respond to that pandemic and to limit the devastation that it wrought. There was really this moment of rethinking institutions, rethinking the welfare net, rethinking what community solidarity looked like and what relationships between neighbors, right? And the question of racism baked into our policies, baked into our practices, baked into housing and education and employment and environmental justice. There was an opportunity and a moment for that. And obviously, the national political context today looks really different. And in the conclusion of the book, what I argue is that we can't think about police violence as separate from community violence. And there's a certain version of that argument that is often made in conservative circles that I do not want this conflated with. And that other argument is that police violence is simply a consequence of community violence. And so therefore the problem is people in the community. It is not what the police are doing. That is not the argument I make in the book at all, but I do note that it is true that the United States has more people shot and killed by the police than any other Western industrialized country, but we also shoot each other at incredibly high rates, right? And I say we, but of course, middle-class white Americans face much lower risks of lethal violence than poor communities of color. And so the community violence fuels police violence, not just in this obvious way that police feel endangered in neighborhoods and so then they overreact in ways that create harm in the community, but it is also true that at a more macro political level, the reason it's so hard to challenge police power is because people are worried about violence in their community. Violence in the community fundamentally undergirds the political power of the police. And so both actually have to be resolved in tandem, not because we should justify police violence with community violence, but because the two problems are twinned. And because both are ultimately driven by structural racism. So it's processes of marginalization, exclusion, and racism that create the social conditions that are ripe for both people engaging in violence with each other in the community and police engaging in violence in those communities. And so it's ultimately, I think that we can do more to reform how police engage in neighborhoods, but I also think the deeper question of racial inequalities in lethal force will never be resolved until we address racism at a much deeper and more structural level, until we don't have massive wealth inequalities, until we don't have massive racial segregation in neighborhoods. Like, you cannot fix that disparity in policing without addressing all of the disparities underneath that. And I in 2020 and even in 2024, it felt like there was more space at the federal level to have that conversation, because ultimately cities are very limited in how much they can redistribute, because wealthy people can very easily move outside of the city limits. So you actually need a higher level of government aggregation. You need that state level or that federal level to pursue a politics of redistribution that would actually make a dent in the kinds of massive racial inequalities that we see across all of these dimensions. So I am less hopeful that in the immediate future we will be having that conversation. I think instead it's very clear that at the federal level, the conversation is about how do we desperately protect the existing infrastructure, which is being dismantled at a scale that we have frankly never seen before. So this is not the time, I think, where we're going to be able to fight for big victories at the federal level. But at the state and local level, and most policing policy is set locally, I think there are lots of ways that we can continue to push forward change even in a really hostile national political context. So one of the things I talk about in the book is that one of the ways out of this perpetual cycle where the community is outraged at the police, but then turning to the police to respond to their calls for help, is to diversify who we're sending to respond to 911 calls and crises in the community. And the last chapter of the book profiles a couple of different innovative models of how we might do that differently, right? Police don't have to be the ones who respond to every 911 call. And in fact, other professionals might be better suited for some of these calls. So one of the most successful diversion programs in Minneapolis right now is the Behavioral Crisis Response Team, which sends unarmed mental health professionals to respond to mental and behavioral crises in the cities. And it is a win-win. The police are responding to fewer of the calls that they're ill-equipped for, and the community is getting a more holistic, appropriate response for those calls for service. And those folks are hopefully better able to be connected to long-term services that better address the crises in the long run, beyond that one point in time intervention with a crisis response team. So that's the kind of example of innovations that cities can make without actually having to invest a lot of money. Like it is cheaper to send unarmed mental health professionals than it is to send police to these calls. There are some scaling up costs for getting programs in place, but a lot of these cities can innovate without having to dig deep financially. And I think it's not only about how do we shift the burden of 911 calls, but also how do we expand people's horizons in their imagination about what's possible and when and where police presence is necessary in the community. So I think there are a lot of things that everyday people in their neighborhoods, the way that they interact with their folks in their communities, their neighbors, the people who are unhoused in their communities. There are lots of ways that people can make investments in reducing harm and disorder at the local level. I also think that at this level of city government, there's a lot we can be doing even without federal intervention to try and reduce the conflict between police and community and provide a better response while we're doing it. And frankly, at least in Minneapolis, there has been such a challenge in hiring and retaining officers that it's not really a question of whether the city wants to innovate. The city has to innovate. Policing looks different than it did in 2020. The force is smaller. And my cautious, optimistic hope is that we can figure out how to right-size police forces so that they have a smaller footprint in vulnerable communities, are responding to the right kinds of calls, and that we have a broader set of interventions to try to interrupt and respond to crises in the community. So I hope, to sum it up, I hope the book gives us a better conversation about police violence, a conversation that gets us out of this tangled loop we seem to continually be in, where outrage over police violence does not lead to the kinds of lasting changes that we want to see, and that it gives us a path forward for thinking about what are the kinds of interventions we can make in the here and now to improve community members, and particularly vulnerable community members' well-being, and what is the long-term horizon that we're fighting for? What is the ultimate vision of change?
Your comments are really encouraging in what otherwise could be seen as a really grim situation. And there's certainly still grim aspects to it, but you've just articulated some possible steps forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So now, Cathy, the narrative of your book is also full, unfortunately, of hatred and oppression. And it's a difficult reality to confront. How are you hoping that readers will react to what you have found and shared?
Well, first, I hope that this book brings some recognition to the Ho-Chunk people's history here in Minnesota. They are not one of the 11 recognized tribes here in Minnesota, although they do claim some ancestral homelands within what is now the borders of Minnesota. And I think a lot of people, white people at least, and some indigenous people don't really know about the Ho-Chunk history here in Minnesota. And how extensive it was, or even how far back it goes like I said, their ancestral homelands. So this book is a starting place for that, in that the Minnesota Historical Society Press published this book. And it is a starting place for their recognition and in their place in history here in the state. And also, many people in Minnesota believe that Minnesota was on the right side of history during the Civil War, since we were an anti-slavery state. But the history of the U.S.-Dakota War really tells a different story, and lots of fine historians have told that story. I'm attempting to engage in some truth-telling in Minnesota history. And when we look at the story of the Ho-Chunk people in relation to the U.S.-Dakota War, they were not involved in the war very much or at all. There was a few people who were around, but they were not as a group. They did not declare war on the United States at that time. And there really was no reason for the Knights of the Forest or the people of Mankato to target them, other than the fact that they wanted their land. And really, this book is about the culpability of everyday folks when it comes to the enactment of ethnic cleansing and colonization. The history of the removal period it focuses on the federal government and those in power as responsible for the removals and all the worst aspects of the removal period. And yes, they are responsible for treaty violations and the legal justifications for a lot of the things that went on. But it was the local colonists, even in Wisconsin and across the Midwest, who formed militias, and they signed petitions, and they organized for removal. Before the arrival, in the case of Blue Earth County, before the Ho-Chunk even arrived in the county, they were signing petitions to ask that they don't send them there in the first place, or that they don't create the reservation there. And this really means, when we look at it, there's a certain culpability for all Americans during this time period, especially the Midwest colonist settlers. And what I hope is that we can remember this when we look around at the world today. We have groups like the Proud Boys, and we have things that are happening in Gaza. And I hope that the reaction of readers is for all of us to look at ourselves and the people around us, and look to engage in this truth-telling more, and understand our own involvement in all of these things.
Thank you. Thank you for those strong statements, a strong call to action. I know I was really shocked to learn about the militia that were organized in Rochester, my hometown. Again, had no idea. And yeah, history isn't something that's happening out there. I think all of your books are really showing how close to home all of this is, and we have a real opportunity to reflect and guide our future actions accordingly. So thank you really to all of you for these powerful, important stories. Thank you to our Minnesota Nonfiction finalists. All 4 of these books are powerful and important narratives that illuminate aspects of our state in new ways. Thank you all for watching, for taking part in this Meet the Finalists panel. If you enjoyed this talk, you can find a treasure trove of past events archived on the YouTube channel of the Minnesota Book Awards steward organization, the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. You can find out more about future programs on their website, thefriends.org. In particular, mark your calendars for Tuesday, April 22nd. That's the evening that the winner in this category and 9 others are finally revealed. Please join us at in St. Paul at the Ordway Center for the Performing Arts. Tickets are $29 inclusive of processing fees. A free live stream will also be available. Visit friends.org/MNBA for details. Again, congratulations to these writers. I sincerely recommend that everyone in Minnesota and beyond read all 4 of these important books, and I hope to see you at the awards ceremony on April 22nd.